Cambodia na Cambodia na nè ban nè chui Campuchia đôi có bung chục hơi rót
When we started as a nation more than 1,000 years ago, we had what Western scholars used to call God kings, because the kings then were gods. They represented everything, including the gods. So everything was centered on the king. And I think that it is one of the reasons why we were so strong, because the people united all around the king. You know, even the intellectuals, they were very obedient to the king. So the king could then lead the people on the way towards more and more strength until we became an empire.
All fortune and patronage radiated from the king down through his courts to peasants in the countryside. Cambodia's strength as an empire was based on rice. The great god kings had power to mobilize labor. Complex irrigation works were built. Up to 3 crops of rice a year were harvested. It was the divine role of kings to fertilize the fields, harmonize the seasons. It also followed that times of drought, political upheaval or defeats in battle were signs that a king's divine energy had drained away. Then loyalties broke down. Even at the height of its glory, Cambodia's fortunes oscillated according to the personal charisma of each of the Angkor kings. By the 15th century, the empire had collapsed. The royal courts and rituals survived, but the potency of the god kings had clearly faded. A more personal form of Buddhist faith took root in Cambodia.
Before we were Brahmanist Buddhist, but not Hinayana. Hinayana Buddhism preaches, you know, tolerance, non-violence, and the renunciation to strength, to force. So we became weak.
In popular songs and drama, the villains who threatened Cambodia were always its neighbours, the Thais or the Vietnamese. The art of survival was to play off one against the other. This play tells the story of one Cambodian king who married a Vietnamese princess. It was a marriage of convenience to seal an alliance with the Vietnamese. But according to the play, the king was outwitted by his Vietnamese wife. She insisted on taking Cambodian land to form what is now the south of Vietnam. Cambodia's kings were no longer warriors. They learned to live by compromise and appeasement. It would be the Vietnamese who posed the ultimate threat to Cambodia. Originally from China, the Vietnamese had pushed southwards, but their expansion to the west was checked by mountain ranges. So this natural barrier came to separate the two different cultures of Indochina. The Vietnamese were populous, imbued with Chinese realism. By contrast, the Thais, the Lao and Cambodians clung to their Indian beliefs and culture. They were less worldly and worked their land at a gentler pace. As Vietnamese numbers increased, they needed more land. Cambodians feared their ambitions.
You know, there was and there is still racial antagonism between the Vietnamese and the Cambodians. The main reason why we cannot understand each other or like each other is simply of a military nature. The Vietnamese, they are very expansionist, militarist. They are conquerors, conquérants in French. So we, the Cambodian, we are pacifist. We like peace. So when we see people so bellicose, warmongers, really we feel very uncomfortable vis-à-vis such a people.
Ironically, it was the arrival of the French that saved Cambodia from disappearing altogether. Cambodia's king actually welcomed the French when they colonized Indochina in the 1860s. He submitted to France. The kingdom became a protectorate. But that was a lesser evil than losing Cambodia completely to the Vietnamese. For their part, it suited the French to preserve Cambodia's royal courts. They'd keep Indochina divided and use figurehead kings to endorse their rule. The last thing the French wanted was to stir up political change.
The French used to be called the colonialists, but like the Hindus, they did not try to force us to be French. They came and they were helping us in the process of safeguarding Khmer civilization, Khmer culture. And so very freely we chose also to be French educated, to speak French alongside the Khmers and so on.
As a young prince, Sihanouk was one of the privileged few to see any benefits at all from colonial rule. In 1941, at the age of 18, Sihanouk was chosen by the French to be king. In favouring Sihanouk, they'd passed over a rival branch of the royal family because they imagined the prince would be easily controlled. He was more concerned with affairs of the heart than matters of state. For peasants in the countryside, life would barely change at all during 90 years of colonial rule. The French were not concerned with village life. They built roads and plantations, and apart from that, they simply collected taxes. The rest was ignored. Even schooling and health at the village level were of little concern to France. For their part, Cambodia's peasants were typically docile. They were loath to pass up their age-old beliefs or methods of farming. There was little incentive on either side to disturb the status quo. Here, the state of the art was timeless. In these villages, there was no revolution to even a simple pottery wheel. Instead, village women still turned themselves about the clay. And they had no need for kilns. The pots were cured on an open fire. Plantations of coffee, rubber and other crops were a source of export earnings that repaid France. But the local benefits were few. By preference, the French imported Vietnamese workers rather than hiring native Khmers. It was much the same in the towns. Middle-class Khmers were shunted aside. Slowly but surely, Chinese merchants were allowed to dominate commerce. And the French relied on Vietnamese clerks and petty officials to staff their colonial service. Cambodians lagged behind, and for nearly half the 20th century, there was no political ferment to bother the French. By contrast, the Vietnamese next door were far from dormant. Their poverty and hardships encouraged opposition against the French. The Vietnamese also had a long tradition of scholars, writers and political activists. Cambodia had none. Not one Cambodian book was written, and there was no Cambodian newspaper before the 1930s. The time would come when Cambodia paid a price for its lack of worldly experience and its lack of depth in leaders. The rise of Japan during World War II finally broke the spell of white colonial power in Asia. Although the Japanese occupation of Indochina was short-lived, it did show that Europeans were not invincible. After the war, when France returned to reclaim her colonies, she was faced with serious trouble. Vietnamese nationalists, known as the Viet Minh, had taken up arms to oust the French from all of Indochina. The struggle for independence was inspired by Ho Chi Minh. As Uncle Ho, he became a legendary hero to the Vietnamese people. At that time, the Viet Minh were simply seen as freedom fighters. They had broad support from all Vietnamese, regardless of class or political leanings. But the ultimate goal for Ho Chi Minh was more than national independence. His life was dedicated to a communist revolution. The worst of the war was fought in Vietnam. But in Laos and Cambodia as well, the Viet Minh combined with local resistance to harass the French. When Viet Minh forces overran the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, that was the close of just one chapter in the struggle for Indochina. The French had been humiliated. In fact, Cambodia's independence was granted in 1953. This was several months before the French were finally defeated in their war against the Viet Minh.
When the French made me king, I remained grateful to the French, but I had to try to force the French to give back independence to the land of Angkor. We used to be a great nation, and France could be our good friend, but should not make us a colony.
Sihanouk was determined not to rely on a Viet Minh victory to end French rule. That might end the monarchy as well. Instead, he launched on a crusade overseas to win press support and embarrass the French with their allies in Europe and America. He proved to be a master of publicity and diplomatic flair. Sihanouk then had won all the kudos for Cambodia's independence. He had stolen a march on the revolutionaries. The king had discovered a taste for politics, but he knew his palace would not be the seat of power. Cambodia now had a parliament, and new elections were due to follow soon after independence. Despite Sihanouk's personal standing, the strongest political party was clearly opposed to the old ruling class, and even the monarchy itself. It drew support from teachers, students, government workers, and those who'd fought the French.
One part of the Cambodian nation, they want Cambodia to be a republic, to be like France. And since then we had many political parties, and the intellectuals in Cambodia, you know, as a French educated people, they studied mainly the history of France, revolution, the cutting off of the head of kings, and so on. So the leader in Cambodia cannot be a king, he must be the president of his country, powerful enough to lead the country, but with an opposition, with a parliament.
Sihanouk's answer was to abdicate and to leave the throne to his father. No longer king, he was free to stand for election. The opposition was caught off balance by Sihanouk's move. The popular vote was never in doubt, and he was elected head of state by a large majority. Sihanouk was convinced that the unity of his people rested on his shoulders and his alone. Only he could serve as a bridge to bring Cambodia into the 20th century. The prince was driven by a passion to be all things to all his people. As he bounced through the countryside, he was still hailed as the Father King, despite his abdication. Whatever city people thought, the mystique of godly energy would never fade for villagers. Sihanouk played many roles, but he was never seen as a military dictator. Indeed, the army was kept very small and the leaders divided, so they wouldn't pose a threat to Sihanouk's rule. There was little chance for either left or right-wing opponents to steal the limelight from Sihanouk. He insisted that all rival parties and factions merge with his own political movement, called the Sankum. Every 6 months, a national congress was staged where Cambodians from all walks of life could air their complaints to the prince in person. In practice, any critics or wayward members of government were exposed to public ridicule. Sihanouk claimed all credits, but he stood aloof from his government's failings. When right-wing ministers proved to be unpopular, he preempted opposition by calling on the left a cabinet of their own. One idealist who dared to speak out against corruption was a popular intellectual named Khieu Samphan. For his temerity, he was attacked in a public street after the Congress, stripped naked and humiliated by security police. In a later crackdown on leftists, Khieu Samphan was forced to flee to the jungle. There he joined up with a tiny cell of communist outcasts. His comrades included Pol Pot and other radicals who'd studied in France. Khieu Samphan would re-emerge in the 1970s as a leader of the Khmer Rouge. The thesis he'd written in Paris would serve as a blueprint for Pol Pot's revolution.
I know very well the family of Pol Pot. Khieu Samphan also. They are normal Cambodians, those intellectuals. I gave scholarship to Pol Pot, to Salot Saw, to Ieng Sari. They were nationalists. And when they went to France, and after studying in France, to become a teacher, professor in our colleges, so they returned to Cambodia as communists.
Throughout his life, Pol Pot deliberately obscured his past and disguised his motives.
He was full of ambition, but in a very quiet way. He kept his ambition hidden in his own heart and never spoke to anyone about it.
Pol Pot's real name was Saloth Sar. He was born around 1925, the second son of a prosperous landowner in central Cambodia. His family was rooted in the land. This tomb holds the ashes of his ancestors, and his family still lives in the tiny village of Prek Sabav. Here along the Stong Sen River, Pol Pot spent a happy childhood together with his 8 brothers and sisters. Even then, he had the qualities that would serve him well in the years to come. A gentle demeanor that masked a calculating mind.
There was no one in the family who knew his thought. He studied hard, but as for his intention, we just didn't know.
When he was just 9, Pol Pot's world changed forever. To further his education, his parents sent him to Phnom Penh, the capital. There, his cousin was a dancer in the Royal Ballet, and through her, he was able to see palace life up close. He saw a royal family that was a shadow of its former greatness, corrupt and a puppet of its French colonial rulers. At school, Pol Pot learned about Cambodia's proud past and how its ancient civilization had been destroyed by foreign invaders. Cambodia's decline would later haunt Pol Pot, and he would one day vow to restore his nation to its former glory. That would be a huge task, for in the 1930s, Cambodia was a tiny part of the French Empire, and its king had little real power.
Think of living under this kind of strain. You're born in a country that is much smaller than its neighbors. You're born in a country that is terrified it's going to be taken over. Historically, it has that problem. You're born in a country where the pervading culture is not necessarily your own. That's the culture of power. It's basically French. And Pol Pot had all of that.
Like a lot of well-connected Cambodians, Pol Pot spent a year as a Buddhist novice, studying the religion that is the bedrock of Cambodian society. His school, however, was French, and Catholic nuns taught him to read and write. The tensions between Cambodian and European culture would shape the rest of his life. In 1941, when Pol Pot was 16, France no longer tried to hide its disregard for Cambodia, installing the pliable 17-year-old Prince Norodom Sihanouk on the throne, who would prove to be a decisive force in Pol Pot's life. Around the same time, Pol Pot enrolled at Cambodia's top high school, named after the new king. Here he mixed with the nation's brightest young minds, who, like him, were opposed to both the French and the monarchy. Pol Pot soon became close friends with other young idealists like Ieng Sary. In 1949, these students became the first Cambodians ever to study abroad, and were sent to Paris, the seat of colonial power. At 24, Pol Pot arrived in Paris just as international communism was at its peak. The city was buzzing with talk of revolution. Here on the left bank, Pol Pot and his friends debated politics in their shabby flats. They were looking for an ideology that would free Cambodia from French colonialism. And as they talked, they came to believe that the answer was communism.
We learned the history of the Communist Party, but in reality, we spoke more of national liberation.
In Paris, he joined the colonial wing of the French Communist Party. Again, there's another confusion. He's not really allowed to be a communist. He's allowed to be a colonial communist. Those stresses and those strains you pay a price for.
Working in his small flat above this cafe, Pol Pot began developing his own political philosophy, a radical blend of communism and nationalism. In 1952, 1 year after becoming a communist, he was ready to speak out. Writing in a student magazine, Pol Pot launched a scathing attack on Cambodia's monarchy.
Cambodian people are kept as slaves, made to work night and day to feed the king and his entourage. Monarchy is a malodorous running sore that just people must eliminate.
As Pol Pot wrote, a war in Vietnam gave him a revolution to fight for. Vietnam was also a French colony, but communists there were strong enough to wage a war of independence. Pol Pot returned from France in 1953 and joined the Vietnamese guerrillas just as they were on the verge of victory. In peace talks, France agreed to give up its colonies in Southeast Asia, but in the deal, Vietnam's communists sold Cambodia out. Pol Pot felt betrayed. The treaty gave Cambodia independence, but the monarchy he hated would remain firmly in place. Even worse, Sihanouk took all the credit. A decade earlier, the prince had been reviled as a French puppet. Now he was hailed as the father of the nation, and Pol Pot's revolution seemed to be slipping away.
We could see nothing new in our lives. There was no democracy. That was being crushed by Sihanouk.
Rather than give up, Pol Pot took his revolution underground and began leading a double life. In 1956, his affable personality landed him a job as a teacher at a respectable high school in Phnom Penh.
As a history professor, he expressed himself very clearly. The students liked him a lot.
At night, Pol Pot's real work began. Meeting here in rundown safe houses across from Phnom Penh's railway station, he and his friends secretly recruited the first cells of Cambodia's Communist Party.
We went from house to house, especially to poor people. In secret meetings, we met the workers to discuss the unfairness in our society.
It was a dangerous game, and as they moved around the city, the communists became obsessed with secrecy.
We did not speak about a communist revolution. To disguise our actions, we were called Angkar, the organization.
In 1962, the secret organization chose Pol Pot as its leader. His code name was Brother Number One. He would soon turn the party into one of the most ruthless the world has ever seen. At 38, Pol Pot was a master of deception. He was still a respected teacher, yet underneath, he was a dedicated revolutionary, plotting to overthrow the monarch. In 1963, he talked openly for one of the few times in his life. He called his followers to his classroom and gave a mesmerizing speech, attacking the very foundations of Cambodian society.
For everyone, once you heard Pol Pot speak, you completely believed him. We could win with that conviction.
Pol Pot hoped that his message would inspire a communist revolution in the slums of Phnom Penh. But his dreams were stifled when Prince Sihanouk began to crack down on his enemies. Pol Pot was afraid the secret Communist Party might be discovered and ordered his followers to leave the city.
Everyone was in agreement that we must leave. Otherwise, King Sihanouk, as leader of the country, would arrest us all.
As he fled, Pol Pot must have wondered what lay ahead and whether he would ever see Phnom Penh again. He disappeared to a place where no one would find him, not even his family.
We didn't know where he's gone. He just disappeared. We didn't know where to look.
Pol Pot came here, to the remote jungle on the Vietnamese border. Living among the hill tribes, he completely changed his approach to revolution. He came to believe that simple village life was communism in its purest form, and began to convert the tribesmen into revolutionaries. World events would give Pol Pot added momentum. By the mid-60s, America had replaced France as the main Western power in Southeast Asia and was now at war in Vietnam. Prince Sihanouk allowed the North Vietnamese communists to establish bases just inside Cambodia. This gave Pol Pot a golden opportunity. His hideout was now right on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the North Vietnamese quickly took him under their wing. He was brought to Hanoi, and then, in a formative trip, Pol Pot went to Beijing at the height of Mao's Cultural Revolution.
I used to say that if I want my students not to become communist, I have to send them to communist countries. So they see that the life there is very hard. But communism in France, you know, that was a good thing. And after being French-style communist, they chose to be Chinese-style. And they were very impressed by the so-called Cultural Revolution.
Cambodia's Communist Party itself was small, and even then it was splintered by factions and plotting. They found some recruits amongst hill tribes in the most neglected back blocks of the country, but to other Cambodians, these minority tribes were black, uncivilized people. While Sihanouk ruled, there was little support for communist ideas in the rest of the countryside. He pushed for reforms to deny any chance to the radicals. Sihanouk also turned to the communist bloc for economic aid. Sihanouk wanted a greater stake for Cambodians in their own economy. So in the 1960s, he launched a drive to nationalize the import-export trade and other key industries. This was a bid to wrest control from local Chinese merchants who dominated commerce. The results were a minor disaster. State corporations were corrupt and badly managed. They were no match for Chinese business efficiency. But despite the failures of nationalization, Sihanouk was firmly entrenched. He was not about to be toppled by domestic problems. Cambodia's peace, however, was constantly overshadowed by the conflicts on its borders. When Viet Minh forces overran the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, that was the close of just one chapter in the struggle for Indochina. The French had been humiliated, but the Geneva Agreement to end the war was doomed to fail when America refused to endorse the settlement. The Geneva Agreement declared both Laos and Cambodia neutral. But Vietnam was divided north and south between the pro and anti-communists. The agreement was broken, and fighting flared in the south almost as soon as the French had departed. Nothing, it seemed, could stop the new war from engulfing neutral Cambodia. America now stepped in. It was backing the South Vietnamese under the rule of Ngo Dinh Diem. President Diem was a Roman Catholic and bitterly opposed to the Viet Cong and Communist North Vietnam. On the other side, the Soviet Union and China were backing Ho Chi Minh against the might of America and its anti-communist allies. With the superpowers bent on destruction, how would Cambodia survive as a neutral? Everything hinged on Sihanouk's personal diplomacy. He chose the path of non-alignment, no military pacts or alliances. He depended on America and France to back his neutrality. But like it or not, he would also deal with the communist camp. He went out of his way to garner the friendship of China, the communist Vietnamese, and the Soviet Union as well. Sihanouk was walking a tightrope, but his aim was to play off the big powers against each other and leave Cambodia out of their war. But November 1963 would prove to be a turning point. The Americans backed a coup d'etat against their own ally in South Vietnam. President Ngo Dinh Diem was overthrown and assassinated. Sihanouk was shaken. If that's how America dealt with an ally, what would they do to a neutral? It may be a matter of months or several years, declared Sihanouk, but the United States cannot win a military victory in Vietnam.
I had to help the North Vietnamese.
Within 2 weeks of Ngo Dinh Diem's fall, Sihanouk ordered the Americans out of Cambodia. And regardless of cost to his tiny economy, he refused to accept any further American aid. He was adamant that any reliance on the United States was now a peril. To Sihanouk, there was only one power with a genuine interest in keeping Cambodia neutral. He turned to China. There was no question of military links. Sihanouk's gamble was based on the strength of his personal friendship with China's premier, Zhou Enlai.
I had much admiration for Zhou Enlai. He was a great statesman, a man with a good heart. And he was very, very popular in China. We met Zhou Enlai and myself. That was in April 1955 in Bandung. So we became friends since then. He used to tell me that I was the symbol of an independent, neutral, and peaceful Cambodia.
In the eyes of Uncle Sam, Sihanouk was courting the devil. But despite America's phobia, it was not a threat from China or even communism that Sihanouk had to fear. The paramount threat to Cambodia would always be the Vietnamese, whatever political mask they wore. He needed to come to terms with the communist side before their victory and to use the clout of China to restrain the Vietnamese. Although China was backing Ho Chi Minh with massive aid and war materials, like Sihanouk, the Chinese leaders were wary of Hanoi's ambitions. The Vietnamese would be a thorn in China's flank if they were allowed to dominate all of Indochina after the war was won. As the war in Vietnam grew, the United States became more and more frustrated. And one of its greatest frustrations was the Viet Cong's use of sanctuaries behind the Cambodian border. In addition, men and supplies from North Vietnam were crossing Cambodian soil as a lifeline to the communist forces. These were the famous Ho Chi Minh trails. Neutral Cambodia was no longer virgin. Sihanouk denied the violations at first, but in fact he had struck a deal with the communist Vietnamese. In return for their use of Cambodia, they agreed to respect her existing borders after the war was over. Sihanouk explained his position 20 years later.
I could see clearly that the Americans one day would like to quit, to leave Indochina and North Vietnam would be the winner. So I made my best. I made all efforts to get the gratitude of the Vietnamese for my Cambodia. Reason why I helped them. I did not want to do harm to the United States. I like Western culture. I do not speak Vietnamese. My wife is half French, half Cambodian, no Vietnamese blood.
ជាម៉ាត់បានសរសេរក្នុងសៀវភៅកម្ពុជាឌីស៊ីឡង់ក្រុមទំព័រ117ថាម៉ូនិកមានម្ដាយជាយួនឪពុកជាអ៊ីតាលីម្ដាយម៉ូនិកបានរៀបចំបណ្ដាញរថពន្ធនិងអំពើពុករលួយជាពិសេសគឺការរត់ពន្ធគ្រឿងអាវុធដ៏ល្បីខ្ទោខ្ទាពីក្រុងកំពង់សោមទៅឲ្យពួកយេកុងដែលផ្ដល់ប្រាក់ចំណេញ250លានរៀលក្នុងមួយឆ្នាំខ្ញុំមិនដឹងថាម៉ូនិកនឹងបានទទួលកម្រៃនេះឬក៏ទេប៉ុន្តែម៉ូនិកបានដឹងហើយបណ្ដោយឲ្យធ្វើព្រោះគោលដៅនយោបាយនិងយោធាគឺផ្ដល់អាវុធឲ្យយេកុងហើយម៉ូនិកមិនបានលាក់លៀមសមានចិត្តចំពោះអ្នកបដិវត្តយួនទេមានពាក្យដំណាលថាសៀនុជាស្ដេចខ្មែរទី2ដែលយកប្រពន្ធយួនកាលចំនួនដើមស្ដេចជាថាទី2តាមជំរឹះដូចនេះបានបញ្ចូលយួនមកកម្ពុជាហើយពួកនេះអង្គាមទឹកដីខ្មែរបន្តិចម្ដងដូច្នេះពាក្យបញ្ឈិតបញ្ឈាមនេះផ្ដល់អត្ថន័យថាដោយសារតណ្ហារបស់គាត់ចំពោះស្ត្រីភេទសៀនុប្រគល់ប្រទេសជាតិឲ្យទៅសត្វតពីដូនតា
ខ្ញុំស្រឡាញ់ប្រពន្ធខ្ញុំគាត់ឆ្លាតវាងវៃណាស់គាត់អាចដើរតួជាអ្នកនយោបាយដ៏ត្រជាក់ត្រចង់មួយរូប
តាំងពីមុនឆ្នាំ1970សៀនុនឹកមមីចង់ត្រឡប់ឡើងសោយរាជជាមួយម៉ូនិកជាហេតុបង្កវិវាទជាមួយមេដាកុសមៈហើយដែលជំរុញសៀនុឲ្យតាំងដំណាក់នៅចំការមនក្នុងភ្នំពេញ
I did not conquer any Vietnamese girl when I was a playboy. So I have no connection with Vietnam.
សៀនុធ្លាប់ជាសិស្សនៅវិទ្យាល័យសាស្ត្រលូលូបាហើយព្រៃនគរមុននឹងក្លាយជាស្ដេចក្នុងឆ្នាំ1941នៅទីនោះសៀនុបានស្គាល់យុវជនដែលក្រោយមកបានក្លាយជាយេកុងចាប់ពីឆ្នាំ1955សៀនុបានអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យពួកនេះចូលមកកម្ពុជាហើយចាប់ផ្ដើមជួយពួកយួននេះយ៉ាងសកម្មក្នុងអ្វីដែលហៅថាសង្គ្រាមរបស់យួនខាងត្បូង
ខ្ញុំចង់ទទូចបញ្ជាក់អំពីពាក្យលោកនិយាយថាកិច្ចគាំទ្រ 100% ផ្នែកនយោបាយនិងការទូតដែលខ្ញុំផ្ដល់ទៅឲ្យយេកុងទៅរណសេរីរបស់យួនខាងត្បូងនិងទៅយួនខាងជើងនោះគឺមិនបញ្ច្រាស់គ្នាជាមួយអព្យាក្រឹតភាពរបស់យើងទេព្រោះវាស្ដីអំពីកិច្ចការពារនគរការដល់ពិសិដ្ឋដែលទាំងនេះជាសិទ្ធិរបស់ប្រជាជាតិមួយដែលត្រូវទទួលបាននៅឯករាជ្យបានការបង្រួមប្រទេសយួនឡើងវិញ
I do not hate the United States, but by opportunism, by patriotism, I had to help the North Vietnamese, and I got their permission to respect always Cambodia as an independent state, a neutral state, non-aligned state, without any interference in our internal affairs from Vietnam.
បំណងរបស់ហូជីមិញគឺវាបណ្ដេញអាមេរិកចេញពីយួនខាងត្បូងមុននឹងបង្កើតរណសេរីរបស់យេកុងក្នុងឆ្នាំ1960ហូជីមិញត្រូវការជំនួយពីខ្មែរហើយតាមរយៈជូអេនឡាយសៀនុបានព្រមព្រៀងជាមួយហូជីមិញនៅកិច្ចសន្យាចំនួនមួយក្នុងថ្ងៃទី11វិច្ឆិកា1958បើសំអាងលើវិទ្យុហាណូយនិងសារព័ត៌មានតាក់សូវៀតហើយផ្លូវលំសៀនុសម្រាប់ផ្ដល់ស្បៀងឲ្យយេកុងក៏បានចាប់កំណើតតាំងពីពេលនោះមកក្នុងខែមីនា1965សន្និសីទមួយត្រូវបានផ្ដួចផ្ដើមឡើងដោយសៀនុនៅភ្នំពេញដែលរួមប្រជុំអ្នកតំណាងយួនខាងជើងតំណាងយេកុងនិងពួកប្រទេសឡាវហើយជំនុំនេះបានបម្រើជាវេទិកាសម្រាប់ឃោសនាឲ្យពួកកុម្មុយនីសនិងប្រឆាំងអង្គការសេអាតូប្រធានាធិបតីឥណ្ឌូនេស៊ីសូកាណូមូហាម៉ាត់របស់សៀនុ ហើយដែលរងឥទ្ធិពលពីពេលកាំងដោយសៀហនុនោះក៏មានវត្តមានក្នុងជំនួបនេះដែរនៅថ្ងៃទី30មិថុនា1969ក្នុងរាជវាំងនៃក្រុងភ្នំពេញសៀហនុបានផ្ដល់ការជប់លៀងជាកិត្តិយសមួយដល់វិញតាន់ផាត់ដែលជាប្រមុខរដ្ឋាភិបាលបដិវត្តបណ្ដោះអាសន្នវៀតកុងបានតែបំពាក់មេដាយឲ្យនិងថ្លែងសរសើរដល់ការតស៊ូរបស់គេប្រឆាំងចក្រពត្តិនិយមអាមេរិកជាច្រើនគ្រាសៀហនុបានដោះលែងអ្នកទោសវៀតកុងនិងយួនខាងជើងដែលត្រូវបានចាប់ខ្លួនដោយកងទ័ពលន់នល់ព្រោះពួកនេះបានជ្រៀតចូលក្នុងទឹកដីខ្មែរតាមការអនុញ្ញាតពីសៀហនុក្នុងខេត្តជាច្រើនតាមតំបន់ព្រំដែនខ្មែរយួនទាហានលន់នល់ត្រូវសហការជាមួយកងជីវពលដើម្បីរុញច្រានខ្មែរក្រហមនិងវៀតកុងព្រមទាំងយួនខាងជើងសាមគ្គីរវាងខ្មែរក្រហមនិងយួនកុម្មុយនីសមានភាពបញ្ច្រាស់គ្នានិងជំនួយដ៏ធំធេងដែលសៀហនុផ្ដល់ឲ្យហាណូយនារវាងដើមដំបូងនៃទសវត្សរ៍60សៀហនុព្រមជំនួយគ្រប់យ៉ាងទៅពួកវៀតកុងក្នុងរាជវាំងគេថែមទាំងបានឃើញសៀហនុប្រគល់នៅបរិមាណដ៏សន្ធឹកនៃអង្គទៅតំណាងរណសេរីវៀតកុងត្រាំប៊ូគៀមដោយមិនគិតពីការប្រកាសបន្តជាគុណប្រយោជន៍ដល់ពួកកុម្មុយនីសយួនខាងជើងនិងវៀតកុងដែលទទួលបាននៅភ្នំពេញនៅគ្រប់មធ្យោបាយចាំបាច់សម្រាប់ឃោសនារបស់ពួកគេប៉ុន្តែក្នុងខណៈដែលសៀហនុកំពុងជួមជ្រែងពួកយួនកុម្មុយនីសនៅក្រុងភ្នំពេញនៅក្នុងព្រៃនៃប្រទេសខ្មែរពួកយួនកំពុងជួយខ្មែរក្រហមយ៉ាងសកម្មដើម្បីរៀបចំរំលំសៀហនុនិងរបបគាត់នៅថ្ងៃទី19មិថុនា1967ទោះបីជាមានវត្តមានពលទាហានវៀតកុងនិងយួនខាងជើងពី4ទៅ6ម៉ឺននាក់នៅលើទឹកដីខ្មែរក៏ដោយក៏សៀហនុបានប្រាថ្នាឲ្យរណសេរីវៀតកុងតែងតាំងអ្នកតំណាងផ្លូវការមួយរូបនៅភ្នំពេញដែលនឹងទទួលបានឯកសិទ្ធិផ្លូវទូតហើយសៀហនុក៏ស្នើលើកកម្ពស់ទំនាក់ទំនងជាមួយយួនខាងជើងតាមថ្នាក់អគ្គរដ្ឋទូតផងដែរតាំងពីខែសីហា1963ចលនាខ្មែរសេរីដឹកនាំដោយសិនលោកឋានដែលមានស្ថានីយ៍វិទ្យុផ្សាយសម្លេងតាំងនៅប្រទេសសៀមបានទីទានឥតឈប់ឈរលើនយោបាយកាន់ជើងកុម្មុយនីសរបស់សីហនុក្នុងខណៈនោះសីហនុបានចាប់ផ្ដើមតតាំងយ៉ាងមានអ្នកប្រឆាំងខ្មែរសេរីពួកអ្នកដែលទៅចាប់ខ្លួនបានក្នុងទឹកដីខ្មែរត្រូវបាញ់សម្លាប់ចោលទាំងអស់តាមបញ្ជាសីហនុអ្នកទី1ក្នុងចំណោមនោះគឺព្រាបអ៊ិនដែលត្រូវបានប្រហារជីវិតនៅថ្ងៃទី20មករា1964ហើយ12អ្នកទៀតក៏ទៅរងវាសនាអាក្រក់ដូចគ្នាក្នុងអំឡុងឆ្នាំបន្តបន្ទាប់អ្នកទាំងឡាយដែលត្រូវបានចាត់ទុកថាជាជនក្បត់ជាតិនេះពិតជាមិនបានក្បត់ជាតិខ្មែរទេគឺពួកគេក្បត់តែសៀហនុម្នាក់ប៉ុណ្ណោះដែលសៀហនុខ្លួនឯងជាអ្នកក្បត់ជាតិខ្មែរហើយទៅបម្រើប្រយោជន៍ពួកយួនកុម្មុយនីស
More and more Cambodians, however, were disenchanted by Sihanouk's breach with America. The loss of greenback dollars was taking its toll. Students were grumbling, the army was bitter, and Sihanouk's stifling control rankled the urban classes. To appease the army and his right-wing critics, Sihanouk appointed General Lon Nol to head a new, more conservative government.
Lon Nol vowed he would kick out the Vietnamese communists, but the Cambodian army was no match for the battle-hardened Viet Cong. Cambodia had become a pawn in a much bigger conflict.
By the late 1960s, Sihanouk had second thoughts. Alarmed by the discontent, he put out feelers to restore relations with Washington. President Nixon, however, had schemes of his own. In March 1969, Operation Breakfast began. The Americans launched a secret campaign of bombing to strike at the communist sanctuaries in Cambodia.
This is not an invasion of Cambodia. The areas in which these attacks will be launched are completely occupied and controlled by North Vietnamese forces. Our purpose is not to occupy the areas. Once enemy forces are driven out of these sanctuaries, and once their military supplies are destroyed, we will withdraw.
US B-52s targeting suspected Viet Cong encampments along the infamous Ho Chi Minh Trail are carpet bombing Cambodia. It is one of the most controversial acts of the Vietnam War and one of the most destructive. Nearly 500,000 tons of ordnance dropped, more than 130,000 refugees driven from their villages. Cambodia is shattered.
Nixon announced that he would go into Cambodia to do what he called dealing with the heart of the matter. This was a fateful decision because it led to the destabilization of this pathetic regime headed by Lon Nol. Lon Nol got sucked into a war in Cambodia. That war led to the rise of Pol Pot.
We had many indirect evidences of Sihanouk's acquiescence in the bombing. He invited Nixon to visit Cambodia while the bombing was going on. He re-established diplomatic relations with us.
ក្នុងខែមករា 1968 អគ្គរដ្ឋទូតអាមេរិកប្រចាំឥណ្ឌា Chester Bull បានមកដល់ក្រុងភ្នំពេញដើម្បីជួយអនុដែលបានយល់ព្រមដោយស្ងៀមស្ងាត់ឲ្យកងអាកាសចរអាមេរិកទម្លាក់គ្រាប់បែកលើតំបន់ព្រំដែននៃកម្ពុជា ពីឆ្នាំ 1968 ទៅ 1969 គ្រាប់បែកជាង 100,000 តោនត្រូវបានទម្លាក់លើទឹកដីខ្មែរតាមការអនុញ្ញាតពីសីហនុ នៅឯដេសង់មិត្តភក្តិផ្ទាល់របស់សីហនុនិងជាអតីតរដ្ឋទូតអូស្ត្រាលីប្រចាំភ្នំពេញនៅចងចាំពីជំនួបនេះ
Hidden in the jungle was an enemy Nixon was hardly aware of. As America fought the Vietnamese, a more sinister army, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge was getting stronger by the day.
I trust so much Lon Nol and my cousin Serimata was this. So Lon Nol must be head of state, not Sihanouk. Sihanouk has to disappear.
Sihanouk appointed General Lon Nol to head a new, more conservative government. In January 1970, the prince took leave from his mounting problems at home. He left Phnom Penh to fly to France.
He wanted help to curb the Vietnamese communist presence, which was arousing Cambodian hostility.
He would also issue a warning to the communist leaders.
I plan to talk to Moscow and Peking and to say to them that they should advise their allies, the Viet Cong, the Viet Minh, to avoid, to refrain themselves from interfering in the affairs of the Cambodian, because Cambodia will not be willing to be communized, and they will meet with strong resistance of the Cambodian people if they want to communize us.
Protest marches were staged in Phnom Penh during Sihanouk's absence. Although Cambodia's troubles were economic, Lon Nol and Serimata were turning the frustrations into popular anger against the communist Vietnamese. By attacking the Viet Cong presence, they were attacking Sihanouk's policies, and that was only a step from attacking the master himself.
The Cambodian people reacted by demanding that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese authorities remove their bases from Cambodia. Popular anger grew. There were large demonstrations outside the National Assembly demanding the removal of Viet Cong and North Vietnamese bases.
In March, anti-communist officers unleashed mobs against the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong embassies in Phnom Penh. They demanded the expulsion of the Vietnamese communists.
Perhaps he was confident of returning later with promises of new economic aid. But within a week, the revolt had gone too far, and Sihanouk had lost any chance to regain control.
No Norodom Sihanouk, faithful to his pro-Communist political belief, condemned the demonstrators and defended the cause of the communists. In this, he was betraying his country and the Cambodian people.
Do you feel that Americans, say the CIA, has helped to stir up this trouble in Cambodia, or are your people genuinely against the Viet Cong interference there?
Everything is possible, but I do not want to accuse the United States. I have not any proof about it, but I can say that some officers in our army and many deputies and many members of the government in Phnom Penh, they want to be your allies in order to have your dollars. They do not think, they don't think about the destiny and the fate of our homeland. They don't mind about it. They are more patriots for dollars than for Cambodia.
Instead of returning to Cambodia, Sihanouk flew on to Moscow and Peking.
ខ្ញុំមានភាពពេកខ្លាចដើម្បីបន្ថែមទៅលើសម្ដីលោកអាមែលព្រោះក្នុងកំឡុងការនោះខ្លួនខ្ញុំផ្ទាល់នៅមុនការរំលំអង្គម្ចាស់នរោត្តមសីហនុដែលពុំមានជាស្ដេចខ្ញុំបានជួបសីហនុនៅក្នុងដំណាក់នៅផ្លូវ Charles Frodke ក្រុងប៉ារីសដែលកាលនោះខ្ញុំត្រូវទៅកាន់តំណែងជារាជទូតនៅគួយបាល់ជាមួយកូនស្រីខ្ញុំនៅពី3ថ្ងៃមុនការធ្លាក់ពីតំណែងខ្ញុំក៏បានទៅលាសីហនុមុននឹងឡើងយន្តហោះនៅថ្ងៃស្អែកនៅថ្ងៃនោះមានមនុស្សតិចតួចណាស់ដែលបានដឹងខ្ញុំសូមធ្វើជាសាក្សីខ្ញុំបានទៅដល់ដំណាក់នៅផ្លូវ Charles Frodke ខ្ញុំបានជួបសីហនុមុនីកនិងអ្នកហែហោមទាំងអស់គ្នានៅឯភ្នំពេញមានព្រះអង្គម្ចាស់សរិមតៈឧត្តមសេនីយ៍លន់នល់ព្រះអង្គម្ចាស់កន្ទលក្រុមគ្រួសារទាំងអស់អិសរជនជាន់ខ្ពស់ទាំងអស់ទាំងមេដាក៏សមត្ថបានទូរស័ព្ទហើយទូរស័ព្ទឥតឈប់ឈរដើម្បីអង្វរសីហនុឲ្យត្រឡប់ទៅកម្ពុជាវិញជាជាងនៅបន្តដំណើរកំសាន្តតាមប្រទេសនានាខ្ញុំជាសាក្សីខ្ញុំមិនអាចលាក់លៀមបានទេហើយបន្តពីការរិះគិតអស់រយៈពេល1ថ្ងៃថាតើត្រូវត្រឡប់ទៅកម្ពុជាវិញឬទេសីហនុនៅទីបំផុតក៏សម្រេចចិត្តនៅវេលាម៉ោង5រសៀលដោយប្រាប់ទៅនាយសន្តាគារឲ្យរៀបចំអីវ៉ាន់និងបំរុងសម្បត្តិយន្តហោះជាមួយក្រុមហ៊ុនអាកាសចរបារាំងគឺថ្ងៃស្អែកនេះគាត់នឹងត្រឡប់ទៅកម្ពុជាវិញព្រោះឧត្តមសេនីយ៍លន់នល់និយាយថាសម្ដេចឪយើងទាំងអស់គ្នាត្រូវការសម្ដេចរាជខ្មែរត្រូវការសម្ដេចព្រោះខេត្តព្រៃវែងកំពុងត្រូវឈ្លានពានដោយយួនកុម្មុយនីសយើងទីពឹងសម្ដេចហើយគ្មាននរណាអាចបញ្ជាបានទេគឺសីហនុបានសម្រេចចិត្តត្រឡប់ទៅកម្ពុជាវិញប៉ុន្តែដល់ស្អែកឡើងពេលខ្ញុំត្រឡប់មកជួបសីហនុម្ដងទៀតដោយខ្ញុំត្រូវឡើងយន្តហោះបន្ទាប់ពីគាត់ខ្ញុំមានការភ្ញាក់ផ្អើលយ៉ាងខ្លាំងព្រោះដោយសារសីហនុស្ដាប់យោបល់ម្ដាយក្មេកនិងប្រពន្ធដែលនិយាយថាសម្ដេចមិនបាច់ត្រឡប់ទៅវិញទេគ្មាននរណាហ៊ានប៉ះពាល់សម្ដេចទេសម្ដេចជាអម្ចាស់ជាព្រះបាទធម្មឹកហើយដូច្នេះហើយទៅលន់នល់នឹងក្រុមរបស់គាត់ក៏ក្តាប់យកអំណាចគេត្រូវមានយុត្តិធម៌ដើម្បីនិយាយតាមដំណើរហេតុការណ៍គឺសីហនុបានបោះបង់អំណាចដោយខ្លួនឯងប្រសិនបើក្នុងថ្ងៃនោះសីហនុត្រឡប់ទៅកម្ពុជាវិញគឺពុំមាននរណាម្នាក់អាចដកគាត់ពីតំណែងឡើយត្រង់ចំណុចនេះគេត្រូវមានសច្ចធម៌ជាមួយប្រវត្តិសាស្ត្រខ្ញុំជាសាក្សីចំពោះព្រឹត្តិការណ៍នេះ
ទោះបីកាលនោះខ្ញុំមានតែ10ឆ្នាំក៏ដោយពួកខ្ញុំដែលជាតំណាងរាស្ត្រមួយរូបក្នុងសភាជាតិធ្លាប់បានប្រាប់ខ្ញុំថាសភាជាតិបានបញ្ជូនតំណាងរាស្ត្រ2រូបមកប្រទេសបារាំងដើម្បីជួបសីហនុនិងអង្វរឲ្យត្រឡប់ទៅកម្ពុជាវិញដើម្បីឲ្យគ្រប់គ្រងអំណាចក្នុងដៃនិងឲ្យយល់ដឹងពីស្ថានភាពតែក្នុងប្រទេសប៉ុន្តែសីហនុប្រកាសមិនព្រមជួបតំណាងរាស្ត្រទាំង2រូបនោះឡើយគេអាចនឹងរាប់ឈ្មោះតំណាងរាស្ត្រទាំងពីរគឺនរោត្តមកន្ទលនិងយ៉ែនសម្បូរក្នុងសៀវភៅកម្ពុជាដូចស៊ីឡង់ត្រង់ទំព័រទី114និង115ជាមកបានសរសេរថានៅក្រុងប៉ារីសឧត្តមសេនីយ៍លន់នល់ប្រធានប្រឹក្សាមុននឹងត្រឡប់ទៅក្រុងភ្នំពេញវិញបានបង្ហើបប្រាប់ខ្ញុំក្នុងថ្ងៃទី11កុម្ភៈ1970ថាបើសម្ដេចមិននិវត្តជាបន្តទៅភ្នំពេញវិញដើម្បីកាន់កាប់ស្ថានភាពក្នុងដៃទីនោះ
អ្វីៗនឹងត្រូវបាត់បង់សូមសម្ដេចយាងទៅភ្នំពេញជាបន្ទាន់សូមសម្ដេចកាន់កាប់រដ្ឋហើយជាពិសេសត្រួតត្រាកងទ័ពនៅក្នុងដៃបើពុំដូច្នោះទេអ្នកផ្សេងទៀតនឹងចាត់ចែងកិច្ចការនេះលន់ណូជាអ្នកស្មោះស្មោះចំពោះសៀនុគាត់ប្រាប់ខ្ញុំថាស្អែកឡើងគឺថ្ងៃទី17 កុម្ភៈ 1970 គាត់ត្រឡប់ទៅភ្នំពេញវិញទាំងបាត់ព្រលឹងអស់ពីខ្លួនព្រោះមិនបានសម្រេចក្នុងការបញ្ចុះបញ្ចូលសៀនុឲ្យត្រឡប់ទៅកម្ពុជាវិញហើយចំណែកស្ថានភាពនៅកម្ពុជាកំពុងតានតឹងខ្លាំងកងទ័ពខ្មែរមិនអាចអត់ឱនបានទៀតទេដោយការជំរុញចូលឥតឈប់ឈររបស់ពួកយួនកុម្មុយនីសដែលក្បត់កិច្ចសន្យាថាមិនបំពេញហួសតំបន់ទីជម្រករបស់ខ្លួនដែលសៀនុបានអនុញ្ញាតឲ្យក្នុងទឹកដីក្នុង
On March 18, 1970, the National Assembly and the Council of the Kingdom met and voted unanimously to withdraw their confidence in Prince Norodom Sihanouk. Thus, on March 18, 1970, Prince Norodom Sihanouk was no longer the chief of state of Cambodia.
Mais nous notons une chose, la première chose, parce que le présent.
Ambition. Mr. Longnol, my cousin Sarimata, they were guided by their personal ambitions. I trust so much Longnol and my cousin Sarimata was this. So, Longnol must be head of state, not Sihanouk. Sihanouk has to disappear. They had to betray Sihanouk in order to be at the top of Cambodia. And true, Sihanouk is an accomplice of the communists.
But was that true? Did you ever feel you were an accomplice?
Accomplice...
or used by the communists?
No. You know, I was conscious that communism was not good, but, you know, I had to be realistic.
When Sihanouk arrived in Peking, he learned the news of his overthrow from his friends, the Chinese leaders. They urged the prince to stay in exile in China and to form a coalition with the communists against Lon Nol and his American backers.
I think Sihanouk's biggest mistake was in simply leaving the country. As long as he was there, he was in pretty good control of things.
The speaker is Alan Dawson, an author and journalist who writes on Indochina.
I think the people who ousted him simply made a miscalculation. I think they wanted to teach him a lesson. But I don't think even the rightest of the right-wing people who were involved in that ever conceived of a day in Cambodia without Sihanouk in power. And a little later, they had a trial that convicted him of high treason in his absence and sentenced him to death in absentia. And at that point, the miscalculation became a severe miscalculation, and Sihanouk could no longer return to the country in any kind of safety. But I think up to that point, he probably could have.
In the drama of March 1970, students, soldiers and agitators stirred up a frenzy of racial hatred against the Vietnamese. The victims were not Viet Cong. They were terrified civilians from Vietnamese families settled in Cambodia for several generations. Far from stopping the bloodletting, General Lon Nol turned a blind eye. Lon Nol was determined to take up the cudgels and to rid Cambodia of the Vietnamese menace. The juggle for peace was over, but there was no conception of what lay ahead. Cambodia's army was absurdly small. Its battle experience was nil. But in a reckless move, the Lon Nol regime issued an ultimatum to the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese. All all communist forces were ordered to leave Cambodian soil within 72 hours. An impossible demand. And clearly, the communist Vietnamese would never comply under threat. Ready or not, the time of war had come for Cambodia. The call to arms was run like a carnival. Volunteers were eager to join up for a chance to drive out the Vietnamese. This was a war to settle the score of centuries. Cambodians spared nothing in venting their rage. There was no Pol Pot, no Khmer Rouge at this time. This was the work of Lon Nol soldiers, and their victims, they said, were Viet Cong. All of these bodies were cut open and the livers eaten. By this ritual, Cambodians believed they would gain the strength of their enemy.
The Cambodians, they have two faces, two aspects. We can smile and we can also kill. Lon Nol first in the years 70s, and also Pol Pot after that, they made the pogrom of their Jews. That is to say, the Vietnamese. I think that it is not the best way to deal with the Vietnamese. We have to try to be in friendly terms, relations with them, not to provoke them, not to make pogrom and so on, because the Vietnamese, they are willing to take revenge against the the Cambodians.
It was not so much revenge as a cold, tactical necessity. The Vietnamese Communist forces simply swept aside the best of Lon Nol's troops within days of the outbreak of war. They took control of all the provinces they needed to ensure their vital supply lines to South Vietnam would not be jeopardized. Cambodians seemed to relish the grand heroics of battle. But courage alone was not enough against the experience of Ho Chi Minh's guerrillas, who'd been at war for over 30 years. To Lon Nol, the war was a religious crusade, which he insisted on directing in person. Advice and logic meant nothing. He preferred to consult with fortune-tellers before planning his battles.
If Lon Nol did not make the coup, I was sure to save Cambodia because you know, by dealing with Hanoi and with Peking, and I was a good friend of Moscow also, I could save Cambodia. One day I saw that one day there would be peace between the West and the communist power, and since, you know, I gave some facilities to the Viet Minh and the Viet Cong, so I could have them as friends and grateful to me and through me to Cambodia. They promised very firmly not to attack us. But since Mr. Lon Nol chose to be with the Americans and against the Viet Cong, so it happened that the contre-coup, the boomerang effect was that Cambodia lost everything.